Today on this panel, we have in person, we have Mr. Mark Ryckman, Manager of Policy for the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And by video conference, we have as an individual, Dr. Caillin Langmann, Assistant Clinical Professor, Department of Medicine, McMaster University. Welcome, gentlemen. When we commence, you will have each of you up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. And we will start with Mr. Ryckman, please. 5 minutes, if you please.
Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of the OFAH, thank you for the invitation to appear at this committee. The OFAH is the largest nonprofit conservation-based fish and wildlife organization in Ontario, with 100,000 members, supporters, and subscribers, and 725 member clubs, with 55 of those clubs operating 122 CFO-approved licensed ranges. Our organization is 95 years old, so we have a long history of advocating for the hunting community in Ontario. While there are provisions in Bill C-21 that we have concerns about, I will keep my comments scoped to the impact of Amendments G4 and G46 on the hunting community. Hunting is an ancient tradition passed down through generations and remains a way of life for many Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Hunting today makes important social, cultural, and economic contributions to our country. It remains an important way to put food on the table, connect to nature, create and foster relationships, relax in the outdoors, and contribute to the conservation movement. Indeed, some take offense when hunting is referred to as a sport or hobby, because it is so much more than that. Hunting isn't just for rural Canadians. Hunters come from urban, suburban, and rural Canada. They are judges, lawyers, teachers, dentists, plumbers, mechanics, even politicians. Hunting provides information and funding for wildlife management, can help control populations and address human-wildlife conflict, and can foster a sense of obligation to give back to nature with conservation activities. In 2018, hunting spending totaled $5.9 billion, and the resulting contribution to Canada's GDP was $4.1 billion. Hunting supported 33,000 jobs and generated almost $2 billion in labor income. The importance of our hunting heritage is even recognized in federal legislation. There is no such thing as a hunting firearm type. Firearms primarily used for hunting are also frequently used for plinking, shooting at the range, or even competition. There are no hardline thresholds for labeling firearms as hunting or non-hunting, particularly when only looking at the appearance or overall design of the firearm itself. It requires comprehensive examination of multiple features and functions of a firearm, like the action and caliber, but will also be influenced by non-firearm considerations like the cartridge, the user, environment, target species, and jurisdiction. We are pleased that the amendments have been withdrawn and applaud this committee for studying their impact. In addition to the nature of the amendments, we were also troubled by their unexpected introduction and the lack of consultation. In proposing Amendment G4, the government jumped directly to prohibitions, skipping over less extreme alternatives that would have helped achieve its goal without infringement on hunters and other legal gun owners. A stepwise and adaptive approach creates better policy and is much fairer for Canadians than the unnecessarily blunt prohibition of guns by make and model. Take detachable magazines as an example. The criminal code already prohibits the possession of any magazine that holds more than 5 shots for a semi-automatic center-fire long gun. If it can hold more than 5 rounds, it must be pinned so that it can't. Bill C-21 proposes to go further and make unpinning a specific offense, as opposed to a lesser included offense. So we have a proposed new offense that hasn't even been enacted yet, let alone been given a chance to work when the amendments were introduced. Even if the government felt compelled to go further, they could take targeted measures, like banning import and sale of new magazines that have the potential to exceed 5 rounds. Our opposition to the amendments is not partisan or emotional or predetermined on principle. It was only after a thorough critical analysis that we arrived at this conclusion. It won't enhance public safety. The evidence simply doesn't support it. Firearms are not the disease, particularly in a nation like Canada with robust gun laws. Gun violence is often symptomatic of much bigger societal issues. Taking firearms away from law-abiding Canadians will not reduce the upstream issues that fuel criminal activity and the demand for illicit firearms. Therefore, model-based firearm prohibitions will continue to fail, as they won't be able to have a detectable impact on reducing gun violence or enhancing public safety. If political discourse remains fixated on finding the firearms that should be banned or saved, then we will continue to underinvest in the resources and time we need to address critical issues that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ryckman. We go now to Dr. Langmann. Doctor, go ahead, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you for letting me present my research regarding Canadian firearms legislation and its association with homicide, spousal homicide, mass homicide, and suicide in Canada. I'm an assistant clinical professor of medicine and emergency physician in Ontario. I serve as an academic peer reviewer in the areas of firearm control, homicide, suicide, violence, and gang deterrence for academic journals, and have 4 peer-reviewed publications on legislation and the effects of homicide and suicide in Canada. In 2022, I presented and submitted my studies in a report regarding C-21 to the committee. The research demonstrated previous bans in the 1990s of a large number of handguns had no effect on homicide rates. Currently, a definition of assault rifles and subsequent bans has been proposed. My research on previous Canadian legislation is applicable in answering the question of what the effects of this legislation may be. Since 2003, the number of owned restricted firearms has doubled from 572,000 to 1.2 million. However, the rate of overall firearms homicide has not increased, nor has the rate of homicide by handguns. There's been recent fluctuations similar to the levels in the early 2000s, but the rate of homicide has actually fluctuated about a steady mean when statistical analysis is performed. In the 1990s, legislation prohibited over 550,000 firearms, including military-style firearms and handguns. However, my studies have demonstrated there was no statistically significant benefit on homicide, spousal homicide, or mass homicide rates in Canada. Restrictions of magazine capacity in 1994 was not associated with decreases in homicide or mass homicide rates. Prohibition of full automatic firearms in the late 1970s was also not associated with decreases in homicide or mass homicide rates. Other jurisdictions, such as Australia and England, have also applied significant controls to handguns and semi-automatic rifles, and no statistically significant changes in homicide rates were detected in multiple studies. Studies from the United States examining assault weapon bans have also revealed no significant benefit. Blau et al. And Segal et al. Found that these legislations were not associated with a decrease in victims. Interestingly, when looking at 30 years of incidents, Blau found that shotguns were more associated with an increase in victims than semi-automatic rifles. Webster et al., using similar quasi-experimental methodology as myself, did not find an association between assault weapon bans and mass homicide incidents or deaths, public mass homicide incidents or deaths. In summary, the evidence so far demonstrates that the proposed handgun and semi-automatic rifle bans will have no associated reduction in homicide rates or mass homicide rates. Methods that have been shown to be more effective in reducing firearms homicide involves targeting the demand side of the firearms prevalence in criminal activity. As demonstrated by StatsCan, a significant percentage of firearms homicide involves gang violence. To reduce violence that is currently occurring in Canada's cities, the evidence suggests that you need to act early to reduce youth gang involvement. A research report by Public Safety Canada in 2012 gathered evidence from programs operating in Canada to reduce the gang participation rate and demonstrated beneficial effects in the ranges of a 50% reduction in participation. Targeting legal firearms owners who rarely commit crimes with new legislation already shown to have no significant statistical benefit will not change Canada's death rates by firearms. The likely billions of dollars forecasted to be spent on confiscating firearms would be better spent on youth diversion and gang reduction programs. Thank you.
We will start with Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I have a question for each. Dr. Langmann, first of all, thank you again for both being here. But Dr. Langmann, your resume is quite extensive, and you're a very humble person, but I would like to highlight some of it. You have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. You received your MD from Queen's University. You are a specialty emergency medical doctor at McMaster University. You received your specialty of emergency medicine at McMaster. You were also a fellow at the Royal College of Physicians in Canada. You were the chief trauma fellow in 2011. You are currently an ER doctor at St. Joseph's. You are also assistant clinical professor of medicine at McMaster University and the director of clinical teaching unit at St. Joseph's Hospital. I could go on, but that was just some of the highlights. You've also studied a number of peer-reviewed papers, and you are certainly one of the foremost experts in Canada from the research that I've been able to do on the issue of gun violence in terms of homicide, domestic homicide, and mass homicide, and the impact, if any, of various governments' gun control legislation. Is that, as a very in brief, a summary of your qualifications and the research that you do?
Yes.
Okay. I have, and I've reviewed your papers, and it would seem that, just to conclude, as you mentioned in your opening, that the gun control measures brought forward in the last number of years by this government and other governments have had no impact on homicide, domestic homicide, or mass homicide. Can you confirm that?
That's correct.
And again, your research is heavily peer reviewed, and you've also been asked yourself by various medical journals to review other research papers in a similar field. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so just again, you have found no statistical significant beneficial association between firearms legislation and homicide by firearm, as well as spousal homicide by firearm, and as well as the criminal charge of discharge of firearm with intent. Is that correct?
That's correct. In this country.
Canada. In this country, yes. Thank you. And your conclusions are based on sound statistical analysis, specifically in particular from the Government of Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, I use a lot of the Statistics Canada data. However, my studies have been peer reviewed. They've also appeared in review articles, including in a recent Canadian Medical Association journal article, and rated the highest evidence that was available for examining this issue.
Very strict evidentiary standard with very high scientific analysis. Understood. And your latest peer-reviewed study went up to include statistical data from up to 2022, including 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I do appreciate you coming very much. I know others will have questions for you as well, but as we all agree, it's important to make evidence-based decisions. So I appreciate you bringing this evidence to the forefront once again at our committee. With my remaining time, Mr. Ryckman, I did want to ask you about the trust factor with hunters, because that's what I'm hearing a lot, that they've seen a number of their commonly used firearms being banned under these two amendments that have temporarily been withdrawn. And we know you really were very eloquent in your opening remarks about the hunting culture in Canada. And there's a bit of a debate that goes on, I know, in criticism of the hunting culture about trophy hunting. But I want to share something with you and for you to share with me what you've heard from your 100,000 members. But I grew up hunting with my dad, and there's a record book for your trophy buck. And it's a huge honor to get in there. And my dad hunted for many years. And finally, to the great pride of my family, he got a 165 typical. It was a really big moment for us, and I'll never forget it. You know, pretty impressive, right? Yeah, and I myself, when I was in high school, I got a special award from my local outfitter or hunting association that gave me a plaque. It was a proud moment for my dad for the biggest buck for my age category. So I know that your associations do a lot of that work, encouraging young people, and it's just very natural to, when you're going to hunt, everyone wants the biggest buck or the biggest fish when they're fishing, and it's a very important part of the culture. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the concern about trophy hunting is that nowadays, you know, simply the use of the term can be somewhat misleading. We don't really have a huge culture of trophy hunting in Canada by any means, at least not the way that some people tend to interpret that term. Generally, that is restricted to, you know, traveling on African big game safaris, for instance, where the meat is left with the local communities, and the hunter, the person who harvests it, takes part of that home with them, the trophy, if you will. So when it comes to trophy hunting or even trophy fishing here in Ontario and Canada, it's very, very, very different. The trophy fish in my family is my daughter's first fish.
Oh, wow.
And it's a small fish.
I got a master angler carp when I was a young girl, so that was a proud moment too. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think it really brings a sense of competition and encouragement. And I know that your association does a lot of that Canadian work, and that there's a huge pride element to that. I did want to just, again, with my concluding minute, can you speak to the trust factor here? Because again, there has to be a lot of trust between the government, who is in charge of the Firearms Act, which is the federal government, and the 100,000 members and subscribers that you have. And I'm very concerned, again, trust in government is very important. We need to be law-abiding citizens. And I am very concerned about this. This is what I'm hearing, but can you speak with the remaining 30 seconds to what you're hearing from your members? Again, that's 100,000 members and subscribers.
Yeah, I mean, from the hunting community at large, we're hearing very much the same thing in that what a bill that originally started as a handgun ban very quickly and unexpectedly was expanded to include some hunting rifles and shotguns. And that moment alone was enough to, I wouldn't say completely erode trust in the government from the hunting community, but certainly make them pause and say, what exactly are we trying to do here? And what is the government's ultimate goal?
Thank you very much. I believe I'm out of time. And again, thank you both for coming.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Ms. Demoff. Ms. Demoff, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Obviously, we're here having these additional meetings because we acknowledge that there were organizations like the Hunters and Anglers of Ontario who were not heard on what was in the bill. So I very much appreciate you being here today and offering your testimony and your expertise. It does mean a lot to us to hear the perspective of hunters. It was never our intention to ban the rifles that are commonly used in hunting. So your appearance here is very much appreciated today. I do have a question though, because there has been a lot of misinformation that has perpetrated into the hunting community that many people feel that the guns they own will now be banned, and in fact, and we have to take some responsibility for that because the list was not easy to understand nor interpret. But do you know how many would still be available, how many models would still be available in the Canadian market if G46 had actually been passed?
I don't actually know the number of units or even the number of different models that would still be available. I can certainly say that that is not, the amendment would not ban every single, at least as written now, wouldn't ban every single commonly used rifle or shotgun right now.
Oh, I had a few people reach out to me, and I checked with Minister Mendicino's office because I myself couldn't interpret the list. And for everyone that I checked, even though they thought it was banned, it was not. My understanding is that there's about 19,000 models that will still be available. But do you know, or have you heard from your members about ones that actually were on the list that you feel should be excluded? I'm just wondering if people contacted you with certain models that they felt that actually was on the list that should be excluded.
Sure. I suppose my response would be in two parts. The direct answer to your query is that the SKS is probably one of the more ubiquitous hunting rifles, and it is clearly on the list. And I think everybody admits that at this point. And that is a rifle that is perfectly legitimate for the purposes of hunting in Canada and in Ontario, and that is on the list. It would be prohibited if G4 and G46 were to have been passed and not withdrawn. The broader concern is that, at some point, if the government has to create a laundry list of exempted guns, it starts to make us question if the legislation was crafted properly in the first place. It's one thing to exempt a single model of firearm or two, but if you start having to, exempt 15, 20, 30, 50 models because the hunting community is concerned about them being prohibited, then perhaps that's more indicative about the wording of the legislation.
Okay, no, thank you. And certainly we have heard about the SKS. I would say, though, that it's been used in 11 shootings of police officers over the last 6 years, most recently here in Ontario, and it was originally designed for the military. I do understand, but there are other models that could be used rather than the SKS. So, I mean, that's it. The intent was to take a look at how these have been used and how they were designed, and that was one that was originally designed for the military. I understand that you have quite a large membership in your organization, and I applaud you for that. There's been pretty big increase in POW owners over the last 2 years. Have you seen your membership increase over the last few years as more people have obtained their POW?
So our membership fluctuates all the time. Sometimes it fluctuates greatly, and there's some nuances about the insurances that we provide to member clubs that actually dictates that sometimes. Some of our member clubs are 4-person hunt camps that have incorporated. Others are, several hundred in size. And, just speaking hypothetically, if we were to lose one of those clubs, that can make a big difference in our membership from month to month. So we certainly haven't seen a linear increase along with the number, or the increase in the number of POW holders in Canada. Obviously the possession and acquisition license is required not just for hunting, for instance, but even for just handgun owners or target shooters or competitors. So you wouldn't necessarily expect every POW holder to be a hunter necessarily, and certainly not the member of a conservation organization like the OFAH, because they're not necessarily hunters.
We have about 30 seconds left, but I would ask a favor. We could probably, I think everyone would appreciate your organization and those like yours to help disseminate factual information and try to dispel some of the misinformation that did get out there. So we would be very grateful in your assistance in making sure that people are dealing with facts and not misinformation when they're looking at this really important legislation. So thank you for what you're doing and being here.
Thank you, Mr. Moff. We go now, Madame Michaud. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins pour...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to witnesses for your presence here. It's most appreciated. I invited the Quebec Association of Hunters to appear today, so we're very happy to hear from the Ontario Association. I'm sure that you have similar positions, but it's still interesting to hear from you. And as I looked at your internet site, I noted that there was a call to action regarding Bill C-21. And you were describing the reasons for your disagreement with the proposed amendments as proposed by the government. Among those reasons, you said that you were concerned with the impact on hunters because several of these firearms are used by hunters across the country. So maybe I'll piggyback on what my colleague Ms. Danoff said. You talked about the SKS, and we've heard a lot about that. You said several weapons. Can you give me examples of weapons which are currently used for hunting, which were on that list? Did your members identify the fact that the weapon that they were using was on the list?
I don't have a list in front of me, unfortunately. I will call back to a report that a colleague of mine authored. It was actually in response to the May 2020 OIC, so it's a little bit further back than the amendments and the new firearm models that are on G46. But we surveyed a large number of hunters across Canada and asked them, of these newly prohibited firearms, which were non-restricted, a day ago, which ones of these, which models are you currently using or were you using for legitimate hunting purposes in Canada? And at that time, we identified, the survey respondents identified, I believe it was about 64 models at that time. Of course, the currency data is a little bit different, and the impact of the amendment and obviously whatever final wording would be imposed or would be adopted would dramatically affect what is actually on that list, right? So the Plinkster, for instance, we can go through model by model. The concern and some of the uncertainty, I will admit, is in the interpretation of some of those proposed amendments. We heard, I listened to hours of standing committee testimony, and the experts from the RCMP and Public Safety Canada and the Canadian Firearms Program and so on and so forth. And they were very forthcoming about what they intended the interpretation of those amendments and those provisions to be. They're not the final arbiters of the legal interpretation of those amendments. The final arbiter is a court of law. So if there is that much confusion in the interpretation of an amendment, then at a bare minimum, it needs to be looked at again, almost certainly reworded, and if it's that bad, it needs to be withdrawn. And that is ultimately what is going to drive the makes and models that are on G46.
Donc, je comprends que vous déplorez la façon dont le gouvernement
So you deplore the way the government proceeded. It was complicated to understand which model was prohibited and which model wasn't. Well, I'll let you answer. I think the answer is yes.
Merci.
Thank you. We received an explanation, a detailed explanation, which is very brief. At some point in committees, we had officials here and we asked them to give us a written explanation. And it's actually easy to understand, but we had a lot of trouble understanding it. It seemed unclear, but this was interesting to see that Appendix 1 dealt with weapons which have already been prohibited since 1990, since the 2020 OIC. And then in Appendix 2, they talked about subparagraphs 97 to 232, which refer to weapons which would be prohibited with the additional amendments. We're talking about approximately 480 brands and models of weapons which are currently not prohibited. So that doesn't add that many. I agree with my colleagues that there was all kinds of misinformation circulating, because if you typed Control F into the document and you had a model number, you thought that it was prohibited, and you could talk about a completely different model. Or, you know, there was a heading previously that said, except for these models. And so it created a lot of confusion. So to try to clear things up, I'm trying to see what's being done elsewhere. Because sometimes it's a good idea to compare what's being done in other countries and to see how they proceeded. The committee analysts and the library were kind enough to prepare a document for me quickly. And I have the New Zealand example. The way they proceeded is somewhat similar to what the government was proposing with G4 and G46. But there is a line that was of particular interest. It said the bill wishes to preserve access to semi-automatic weapons of lower capacity recognized for being used by hunters and farmers. So we see that in New Zealand, they proceeded similarly, but with that attention for farmers and hunters and perhaps even indigenous peoples using certain models. Now, we understand the government is going to go back to the drawing board and try to come up with something. Do you believe that in this new proposal, there should be this kind of attention for hunters and farmers and indigenous peoples as New Zealand did?
That's an excellent question, and thank you for that detail. I would have to think about that a little bit harder. I will say, though, that going back to the trust concerns that Ms. Dancho echoed, even if something like that were written into this legislation, the government has lost the trust of many people in the hunting community. So those people might not trust the government to actually say, you know what, you've identified this as a legitimate hunting rifle, so as promised, we will not prohibit it. That trust is gone, and it's going to take a long time to rebuild that trust. So while on paper, it seems like a very logical compromise, I'm not sure it would go nearly far enough to assuage the concerns of the hunting community.
Thank you. Merci, Madame. We go now to Mr. Julian. Go ahead, please, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses. This is all part of the feedback that we need to get as a committee as we look to next steps after the withdrawal of the amendments. Dr. Langmann, I would like to start with you. You have stated that even with the increase in firearms, it was the rate of homicides, suicides did not change between 2003 and the last year of the study. Right?
Yeah, so there's been no overall, so there's a fluctuation that occurs, but statistically there isn't an increase associated with an increase in the rates of firearm ownership.
Okay. Have you been, as part of your study or as part of your work in analyzing other countries, you referenced Australia and England, Madame Michaud has just referenced New Zealand. Have you also done analysis in terms of untraceable, or the rise of untraceable ghost guns, firearms that are not, we're not able to register or trace them. Has that been part of the study work that you have done?
So all firearm homicides are included in the research. Unfortunately, Statistics Canada doesn't label guns as ghost guns. They'll label them as other at times, sometimes if it's difficult to identify or they just were not identified in the report. So currently there's no real record of specifically ghost gun homicides or ghost guns used in crimes.
Statistics Canada treats ghost guns as kind of a ghost in terms of the statistical follow-up.
It's a new era. It's a new thing that we're starting to see, right? So they're going to have to catch up with their methods, and so will the police services that report these to Statistics Canada.
Now, I mean, anecdotally, in terms of the news, we've in the United States, I understand there's been 1,000% increase in the use of ghost guns. So I understand the statistical problem, given that it's not actually something that is tracked by law enforcement on this side of the border as much, or by Statistics Canada. Is this something that is part moving forward that you would like to study or quantify? Because it appears to be an increasing problem, but obviously not something, as you point out, it's something we have to catch up on.
I mean, it's definitely something I would like to look at. Unfortunately, right now, the data doesn't exist.
Okay. You referenced gang violence. I know you've provided recommendations on anti-gang strategies, which has been really important. Do you see a link between the use of ghost guns and gang violence? And though I understand you can't quantify that this is something that should be of increasing concern to all of us who are looking at public safety?
Anecdotally, it is. The rates have increased, and of course, as measures are taken to restrict firearms ownership, there will be a black market that exists, and we're starting to see that. These things being printed. Also, 3D printers are becoming a lot more common across North America as well. So it's one of those things where you're going to start needing to target the demand side of the equation. You're trying to control the supply side right now by banning firearms based on spurious definitions. And really, if you don't start targeting the demand side, you're not going to see any benefit. You're targeting usually legal gun owners who are going to comply with the regulations. They're the most likely to be involved in criminal activity in this country. They've already gone through screening. And so it's no wonder that when I look at these legislations, I don't see any benefit, because you wouldn't expect to get any marginal benefit on a group that is already such a low risk. That's probably where you should start directing your work, is towards the demand side.
Yeah, so given that, you have recommendations that you would make to this committee on the demand side, and specifically understanding the difficulty in quantifying the extent of the ghost gun problem, how as a committee we should be looking at that issue as well.
Well, the difficulty is, for a lot of criminals, they just need the gun for one purpose at one time, and then they can throw it away. And so even a printed polycarbonate barrel, one use, and then it's done. So the recommendations I would give you would be to start targeting youth at risk, very early at risk, so that are starting to get involved in criminal activity, and start youth diversion programs, diverting them away from that activity. Cognitive behavioral therapy, starting to work on the significant methamphetamine problem that we're seeing in all our communities across this country. Currently, my emergency department right now behind me is full of patients that are intoxicated or suffering from psychosis from methamphetamine abuse. I think that really this focus on a small segment of society that uses firearms for generally a legitimate purpose is maybe diverting your attention from a significant need right now, which is to start looking at diversion right away and funding those areas. There was, like I said, a 2012 report by
Thank you,
Public
Doctor. I'm going to
Safety.
have to cut you off there.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. We'll start our second round now with Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd, please go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The whole premise of why we're here today is because it was believed, a group put forward the argument that we needed an evergreen definition of what an assault-style weapon would be, because the argument was made that gun manufacturing companies are attempting to circumvent Canadian laws by introducing new models into Canada that are not covered by our existing laws. Mr. Ryckman, you are well-versed in firearms. Is there any evidence that that gun manufacturing companies are attempting to do this, as has been claimed?
Yeah, unfortunately, I probably can't speak intelligently on behalf of the gun manufacturers, although I will say that generally speaking, any business responds to the market. Generally speaking, the concern that we have with the evergreen definition in general, our position is that any attempt to adopt an evergreen definition of a prohibited firearm expanded in such a way that it tackles or includes semi-automatic centerfire rifles and shotguns will impact the hunting community, plain and simple.
To maybe, thank you for that, to rephrase sort of, I mean, as a hunter myself and hunters that I know, the firearms that we use have been firearms that have been used in this country for decades and decades. Would you say that the vast majority of firearms used by hunters that you represent are models and makes of firearms that have been used for a very long time in this country?
Certainly currently, yes, that would be the case. Yep.
So is there evidence that, are you seeing new models of firearms coming out for the purpose of circumventing Canadian laws, and are people using these firearms for hunting?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question, Mr.
Okay.
Lloyd. Sorry.
Now, Dr. Langmann, sort of similar question. Are you seeing evidence that it's new models of firearms being manufactured by firearms companies for the purpose of circumventing Canadian law? Are these being used in crimes? Is this something that is truly an issue?
Well, criminals will use any firearm they can obtain. There's not a firearm specifically they're looking for, mostly handguns, but they will use whatever they can get. The SKS as was brought up earlier. It's a firearm that's been around since the 1940s, and it's commonly used. It was very cheap and sold broadly in this country after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So we've seen a lot of those being used because they're widely available, but it's just due to a commonality reason. So something that is common is used. All types of firearms are extremely dangerous. So the bolt action rifle, what we're calling hunting rifles, those have been used to kill police officers. Those have been used to kill patients that I've seen. They're extremely dangerous. They're more dangerous, I think, than what's commonly called an assault rifle, because the caliber and the energy from the projectile is a lot higher than most, quote, assault rifles like the AR-15.
Another interesting
to me,
thing
as a physician,
that was another
it
interesting.
doesn't make sense.
Some previous witnesses made the distinction between military calibers and hunting calibers. Mr. Ryckman, is there such a distinction? Are there truly such things called military calibers and things that are hunting calibers?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that, most people are talking about military firearms more than anything. I mean, there is so much overlap, not just in caliber, as you mentioned, between military firearms, true military firearms, and the civilian versions that evolve from some of those military firearms.
NATO standard is a 7.62 millimeter caliber round.
Right.
Is that smaller than what most hunters would actually use for hunting?
Yeah, unfortunately, the variation, even within Ontario, even within the Ontario deer hunting population, there is significant variation in preference for caliber and type of firearm and so on and so forth. So I don't think I can speak accurately about the variation across Canada, but I imagine it's significant. So the choice of a firearm, the choice that a hunter...
calibers that are
Very common.
larger than what the military
Yes.
uses.
Yes. Yeah.
So by classifying military calibers as large calibers, we're actually capturing more hunting calibers than we're actually capturing calibers of cartridges that are actually used by the military.
Yeah, quite possible. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. You know, I was reading a
15
really
seconds.
sorry.
15 seconds.
Well, Statistics Canada came out with very interesting back in December 2021 firearm violence. 0.47% of violent crimes had a rifle or a shotgun present. 0.47% present, not necessarily used, but present. So we're talking about a very small amount. Out of that, a significant amount of those were gang related. So when we're talking about legal firearm owners and the legislation that we're bringing forward here today, we are talking about a fraction of 0.5% of total violent crimes in this country. And we're missing the whole boat
Can we
on
wrap it up?
99% of crimes in this country. Thank you.
Do you need a quick answer for that?
I would like to answer. It probably won't be quick though.
Go ahead. Well, do what you can and I'll cut you off if you go too long.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right in that, you know, ultimately we need to be helping the people that need help. We need to take guns away, whatever guns they are, from people who shouldn't have them, plain and simple. We need to ensure that our enforcement bodies have the funding, the training, and the tools that they need to deal with things like organized crime and gun violence. That includes the upstream determinants of involvement in crime and so on and so forth. So we ultimately, and finally, I should say, not ultimately, but we also need to ensure that the justice system treats violent crime, including gun crime, with the severity that it deserves.
Sure.
Thank you.
We go now to Dr. Hanley. Doctor, please go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the chance to appear before this committee. I'm speaking to you from the Yukon, and I want to thank the committee members all around the table for the tremendous work that you've done on this bill. So consider me as somewhat of a newbie to the committee, but nevertheless, a couple of maybe a minute and a half or so with Dr. Langmann. Thank you for your work, and I think you have a long history of careful work on this. I just wanted to know what your confidence is in the data, because I've also heard that there's actually a lack of data. We really don't have enough data to be able to correlate the association between particular firearms and whether legal or illegally acquired, for example. And incidents, and I'm also worried about the perception that what we've achieved so far with gun control as one aspect of prevention of gun violence, that maybe we've gone too far. So I just want to know how confident you are in the amount of data we have, and if you believe that we should have more data to be able to really understand what's going on.
So you're asking someone who's a statistician if they'd like more data, and the answer is yes. We always like more data. The good thing is that actually there are a very low number of mass homicides in this country, and so that alone speaks to something. Partly it's a population issue, but however, I do in terms of analyzing the data, sensitivity tests it's called, to see how good is the data at predicting something. And the answer is it's actually fairly good at predicting whether, say, for instance, a certain legislation has had any beneficial effect. So in terms of homicide and spousal homicide and mass homicide, suicide, et cetera, I can say that. I would love to have, of course, data regarding where the guns were obtained, how specifically they were used, as well as the background of the perpetrator in terms of whether they have criminal background, whether this was used in a familicide, those sorts of things. Unfortunately, a lot of that data is also private and protected, so Statistics Canada has certain controls in terms of keeping that information. But that would be something for the government to, of course, mandate and work on.
Thank you. We'd love to have you elaborate on that, but I want to move on. But I do want to just point out the CMA policy statement on gun violence, where they point out through international review that civilian access to firearms with rapid fire capability does result or appears to result in an increased incidence of mass shootings. So it's really to point out that the overall correlation between poor control availability of firearms and mass shootings, which is, I know, one of the intents of this this bill C-21. But I want to quickly turn back to Dr. Ryckman. And Dr. Ryckman, you know, you've written quite eloquently. I've read some of what you've written on your website about trying to find common ground. So maybe in an attempt to find some common ground here, I haven't, despite, I'm sure you're aware of many of the concerns expressed from my constituents in the Yukon, but I haven't yet met anyone in the Yukon who does not deplore gun violence. And I also want to commend what I just heard from the testimony of the witness from Police Souvien in the previous hour, a powerful testament to the value of hunting. So I see that there is possibility to converge on some common ground. Do you see that, do you see gun violence in Canada as an urban issue, a rural issue, or both, or neither?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll admit I'm not an expert on gun violence. I will say I think you'd be hard pressed to find any Canadians that don't think the government can do more to reduce gun violence, even though we are not America by any stretch of the imagination, despite the onslaught of American media stories that we get every day. Canada does have very robust gun laws, a very robust legislative framework that dictates the use and ownership of guns. So we are not America in that regard, and there's always more that the government can do. The question becomes, what is the threshold? What is the goal of the policy that the government is trying to do? In this case, started out as a handgun ban, and as I said earlier, unexpectedly morphed and evolved into something that was a direct impact on the hunting community. So while I agree with you, gun violence is an issue, I think everybody would agree with you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. On y va maintenant à Madame Michaud.
And now over to Madame Michaud. 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I'll continue with you, Mr. Ryckman. You are probably aware of the fact that after the amendments were tabled by the government, all members of all parties received hundreds and hundreds of calls, emails, etc., from people who were angry, who didn't understand. And we all heard about it in our official dinners and our writings, but also at family suppers, dinners with friends. Everyone had an opinion, and that's fine. I wasn't surprised, but perhaps, well, maybe surprised to note that sometimes when I would talk to hunters, their response was, well, if my hunting weapon is going to be prohibited, I'll buy another one. Now, we understand that that wasn't the reaction of every hunter, and that's fine. And it's to be expected that they could be heard. But my understanding is that the government did not consult hunters before introducing these amendments. So that's totally legitimate to hear from them. But do you believe that this may have fed their attitude, the fact that they felt that hunters didn't know what the next steps would be? For example, if the bill were to go through with these amendments, in which perhaps there are weapons currently being used for hunting, the fact that hunters didn't know what would happen the day after the bill would go through. Would they be arrested by the police because they have a prohibited object? Or would there be a buyback program? Would they be able to sell their weapon back to the government? Was the police going to burst into their house to get their weapon? There was no answers to give at the time when the amendments were initially tabled. Do you think that this really increased the upset that hunters were legitimately feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's been mentioned a couple times already in that there was, not only was there some disinformation, there was some misinformation, there was simply a lack of clarity, and the responsibility for that lies mostly on the government for the way it was introduced. You're absolutely right in that the OFAH did not provide comment on Bill C-21 originally. And even if we had, we would not have been speaking about the amendments because they didn't exist at the time. So we would have been speaking about the content of the bill in front of us, which is entirely different than what we're talking about today, or what I'm here to talk about today. So uncertainty is absolutely a driver of concern. Not just uncertainty about how to interpret some of those provisions that were being proposed, uncertainty about whether or not the RCMP was going to be knocking on somebody's door and taking their gun. whether or not they were going to be properly compensated for property that they legally owned the day before. So you're absolutely correct, and I would agree that confusion drives some of that concern, absolutely. And we made a concerted effort to get as much information from public safety and the government as possible and put that out there. And I will say before I finish that you're welcome for all those emails. We did not create this issue. We did not create the anger and the distrust in the hunting community. The process did, and the content of the amendments did. We simply gave people a very straightforward and easy way to contact their members of parliament.
Merci, Madame. Mr. Julian, please go ahead, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go to you, Mr. Ryckman, just so I understand where your organization was prior to the amendments being tabled. What was the position of your organization on C-21?
Great question. Without going into a huge summary of our submission, I'll leave it at there were some concerns about C-21, some impacts on people having their firearms taken away through the red and yellow flag laws, for instance, without a proper hearing or without notice. Not necessarily anything that could be assuaged through amendments, for instance. I will also say, though, that the amendments that we're here to talk about today, or that I'm here to talk about today, are clearly an impact on the hunting community, and that is our mandate to promote hunting. Part of our mandate is to promote hunting in Ontario and do what we can to protect that heritage. A lot of the content of Bill C-21 itself lies outside of our charitable mandate. So while we may have some concerns, there isn't a whole lot of lobbying that we necessarily do on some of those provisions. Yeah. So
the amendments certainly changed that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned, and I may have misunderstood, so please correct me if I'm wrong. You said that you had done a survey and there were 64 models that members of the organization had indicated were impacted by the amendments.
Sorry, just to be clear, I was going back a little bit in time to say that that survey was conducted in response to the May 2020 Ordering Council, which banned a bunch of firearms. So if we were to conduct a similar survey today, or let's say a month after those amendments would have passed, for instance, the answer would have been much different because the list of firearms is much different than it was as a result of the OIC.
Okay, well, let's come back to the 64 models then with the OIC. Can you extrapolate, or do you have an idea of how many of your 100,000 members would have been impacted? There's the model side, and then there's the actual numbers of the people that have those models.
Yeah, that's a great question. Those details I don't have off the top of my head. I do have a copy of the report. It's fairly extensive that I could provide to the clerk if there's interest in me doing so. Again, I would just add the caveat that was in response to the May 2020 OIC, and the responses would be different, as a result of the amendments.
Yeah, I think it would give us a better idea of the impacts, right? Yeah.
That's 3 seconds, so that's good. We'll go now to Ms.
As if my time was up on my side, I thought so.
Well, I appreciate the 3 seconds back, right? Mr. Mott, we'll go with you, 4 minutes, followed by Mr. Chang with 4 minutes. We'll cut it back a little bit.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll go to Dr. Langmann. Doctor, the government tries to convince the Canadian public that they employ evidence-based decision-making, but based on your testimony and extensive, credible, non-government funded research, there's no evidence to support that firearm prohibitions have any impact on public safety, homicides, or suicides. So it seems to me the government is rather involved in decision-based evidence making. So I think the committee really has to ask itself, would we rather have less firearms as they're proposing in our community, or would we rather have less criminals committing crimes with illegal firearms? And I mean, I will say that it seems to me that the lazy approach is to just outlaw firearms as they're trying to do. But your research, in your research, this would have a corresponding effect. You say it in nothing to do with ending gun violence, ending homicides, mass homicides, suicides, domestic violence. in the time that's left, can you please explain your thoughts on that, please?
Sure. I mean, the current proposals even confuse me because they're talking about assault weapons, and in terms of research, it's really hard to know what even that means. Because in my mind, they're probably talking about semi-automatic rifles. And so if you look at all the research, both that I've done and in other countries, actually, so Australia did ban majority of these, as well as Great Britain. And there's no evidence that it's reduced the homicide rates there. The fact is that people can still use other types of firearms, so bolt action rifles. Derek Bird in 2010 drove around Great Britain with a shotgun and a bolt action rifle and killed 12 people. So it's possible to commit these acts with any type of gun. What the legislation seems to do is it targets the sort of legal gun owners, and it doesn't seem to target. It did in terms of some of the mandatory minimums, but for the most part, it seems to target legal firearms owners with a variety of legislation and restrictions. And you're targeting a group of people that are rarely involved in criminal behavior. And so it would seem to me that your best target would be trying to reduce demand in the criminal area, trying to reduce the movement of young, usually male youths into gang behavior, and trying to deal with some of the proliferation of street drugs that have occurred in this country. We're at a dangerous level in terms of methamphetamines now. This is what I see in the emergency department all the time. And all I hear is we're targeting a bunch of hunters. It doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like we have our blinders on almost to what's going on around us. And I could go on, but I think that's...
Please do. Please do. I have a minute left. I want, the floor is yours.
Very well. I mean, just to go back to this assault weapon, it's no wonder to me that we have this strange list, and we have some guns in it, some not, and it doesn't seem to make sense to anybody, and it doesn't make sense to me as a researcher, because to me it would be based on, you know, the action of the actual rifle. So is it a semi-automatic rifle? Is it a bolt action rifle that we're concerned with? And then are we concerned with the fact that most hunting rifles actually use high caliber, high velocity, high energy projectiles that can cause serious damage, and yet we're talking about those as if they're not a concern, and yet these sort of assault rifles like an AR-15 that uses a small caliber is somehow our big concern. You need a better definition if you're going to do anything, and if your definition is does semi-automatic rifle bans result in reduction in homicide, the answer is no. No, there's no good research that shows that from the United States, from Australia, from this country. So choose something else.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Motz. We go now to Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang, go ahead, please, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I cede my time to the committee. So if you like, we can adjourn the meeting.
Very well. Thank you all for your time here today, and thank you to the witnesses. It's been most helpful. Your expertise and experience will help us a lot. So thank you all. And with that,